So welcome back to another episode of the Investigating Pathways podcast. Today I'm joined by Anuj Srivastava, who is the founder of the popular interior designing platform Livspace, which is essentially a cloud-based platform integrating consumers, designers, and vendors to deliver redesigned spaces. Anuj Uncle, thank you again so much for being here and taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So for those listening who don't know who you are, could you tell me a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I founded Livspace, which, as you aptly described, is the leading interior design and renovation marketplace built on top of a unique sort of platform, cloud-based platform. I founded the company in 2015, and in a little over 4 years of commercialization, we are the largest of our type in the Asian regions that we operate out of. Most recently, before Livspace, I used to be on the product and growth team on various faculties at Google in the Bay Area. And at Google, I worked for close to about 8 years, wherein I managed multiple initiatives, including mobile payments, shopping, sort of a couple of years on the Google Maps team. And I joined as part of our advertising network called AdSense, wherein I worked with teams in Western Europe, New York, and San Francisco. I grew up in India, went to IIT, and did my MBA from London Business School.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about your origin story, right? So could you tell me a little bit about and expand on your life as a kid before you went to IIT Kanpur?
Yeah, I most of my early years, my schooling years, really were spent in a North Indian city called Kanpur, which also has one of the Indian Institute of Technologies located. Um, this is sort of an old British cantonment. And oddly, it had very good quality, what used to be called English medium schools, yeah, and or the equivalent of, I think, private schools in the American parlance. So I went to a couple of those. Jaipuria Public School, for those of the kids who'd remember. Your dad actually was also my classmate in one of those. And before that, I went to St. Aloysius High School. So my early years, actually, I do credit a lot of how I grew up thinking to the experiences that I had in the early years, especially the teachers and the friends that I had, and just sort of growing up in a very sort of very well managed location, actually, oddly, in that North Indian city. My parents, very highly educated. My dad was a professor; he's no more. My mom, who was actually getting ready to become a professor, got married, had my elder brother, who also went to an IIT, and subsequently, spent most of her duration, really making sure that we guys are, being brought up really nicely. But I think very uniquely, I think growing up as a kid, I was, like many people who've had similar backgrounds. I was, of course, very good at my academics, but I always used to try to do different things, and I think I had a perspective about myself wherein I really wanted to not just be a bookworm, and I really spent a lot of time trying to cultivate a significant amount of exposure to extracurricular activities. I was good at music, I was good at speaking, reasonably good at athletics. I had a small accident, and which really came in the way of me, sort of stopping physically strenuous activities. But I was like really good at sort of 200-meter dashes and 400-meter dashes, and jumping around and so forth. And so cricket, obviously. So the childhood was like an assortment of course, academia and academic performance meant a lot. I think it's very true for most sort of Indian families. But I think I was lucky in that my parents and friends and the school that provided great infrastructure for just learning and immersing in many extracurricular type endeavors as well. And I think I'm very grateful to the fact that I actually did spend substantial amount of time pursuing things beyond just the academic day to day. It mattered a lot to who I became eventually.
Awesome. That's very cool. So I know you mentioned that you went to IIT Kanpur, obviously, right? So could you tell me a little bit about that story, right? How come you ended up going there? What was your experience like there? All of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think the path in that, I mean, I'm one of two brothers, and my elder brother, who's about 7.5, 8 years elder to me, sort of in a sense uh, maybe paved that way. He got through the IITs relatively early, and so in a sense, I actually grew up throughout most of my childhood having a brother who actually was quite a high achiever, and and I'm sure in many subtle ways it probably influenced me, and also I think made me think that that's actually relatively easy and possible. So oddly enough, I actually grew up thinking that getting through the IITs is like getting through any other undergraduate or any other sort of high quality college. So it wasn't that I was worked up about it or nervous about it or it mattered beyond what it mattered. So I just took it in the way. And I think, and I'm very sure that it was because of the fact that my actually brother was able to get through, that in my head somewhere I was convinced that I will be, I will get selected. And I think sometimes when you actually are convinced that these things are easy, you actually work your way towards those kind of outcomes. So I'm sure that that really contributed. So getting to IIT it wasn't a cakewalk. Obviously, I put in the relative amount of work, and I think that's the time when your dad and me, along a whole host of us, we became very good close friends. And we were like I think four of us, which were close friends, and I think all of us got through the IIT, which was excellent. And we eventually, of course, stayed in the same dorm and whatnot, and we continue to be very close friends, even till date. But IIT was a very unique experience, not just because of the the brand name and whatnot. But I think it was for the first time that um, I experienced a setup wherein everybody was at least as intelligent, if not more, than you were. So it was important to actually firstly have the humility to recognize that. I think that was like I'm generally humble, but I think IITs was very interesting because everybody had some degree of uniqueness in them, no matter what their background was. And I think that's very unique about the IIT setup in India, wherein kids mostly could come from absolutely anywhere. Some of them actually were from villages, I mean, it was, so we, of course, were not from the metros, but at least large cities. There were many who were actually from very far off corners in the country and small villages, smaller towns. And people just on the sheer dint of their intelligence were able to sort of get through that process, which was very revealing, I think, and very very humbling as well. An anecdote that comes to mind is like some of the colleges in the US, and I think the IIT curriculum is really built on, I think, an assortment of the US colleges. I think IIT Kanpur in particular is built on Penn and MIT and Stanford and whatnot. So going in, there was this culture of surprise quizzes, which used to happen in the tutorials. And I remember, like, for my first 3 mathematics quizzes, I got like 0 on 10, like back to back to back, sort of no scores. And this is after, like, the entire my entire life, or I would ace every examination possible. So there was a lot of grounding that actually happened, and I think everybody who probably, and I think still, at the IITs, continues to go through that experience. And I think it's very important because you settle down and you find your own place in the sun. So IIT sort of largely, I think I adjusted to the fact that there will always be people who are insanely bright and brighter than you, and there will always be other people who will think very similarly about you. But even in that place, I think the whole notion of me differentiating my own existence was very crucial to me. So like I did in school, I, of course, spend a lot of time, I think, above and beyond the classroom. And I think I really got excited about the fact that there is such a spectrum of talent within the class. And I think I've of course managed to create some of the best friendships, which have of course extended beyond now, and I think which is excellent. I've worked with some of my friends from my wing actually in other companies, at Google. Some of them happen to be my investors, some of them whose companies I have invested in. So I think the friendships that you make at IIT, I think, are very high caliber, very humble people, but very importantly, I think it stays with you for your life. I think if there's one thing that I remember again and again is the quality of friends, that I inherited, and how well they have done, and just how utterly humble that they continue to be. So I think if that's one experience that stays, with me, is just the quality of friends, and I think the sheer humility of and the talent that actually exists, in that place.
Yeah.
And the statistics are there for everybody to see. But I think it was very fortunate to be able to spend those years in such an early formative part of your life in that institute.
Very cool. It's awesome. So now I want to touch briefly on a few of the jobs you had out of college for a few years, right? So pretty much everything prior to the time that you worked at Google. So was there any interesting experiences, any stories from there that you found particularly insightful or impactful that you'd like to share?
Yeah, it's very interesting, like, because in building Livspace actually brought me back to like new India in a way. And I, of course, spent such a substantial amount of time really close to, when I exited from IIT. In a few years later, I was actually outside the country. I did my master's at the London Business School, and subsequently most of the life was really in the Bay Area, right, where I stationed. And it was an amazing existence. But I think sort of two core experiences which were crucial was, so I spent maybe a year and a half working for PepsiCo, and most of that duration actually used to be in India. And I worked I worked closely on what probably would be sort of Gen 1 distribution infrastructure getting established for consumer goods company. So a lot of great companies like Unilever's and Procter Gamble, they've actually established the first generation of distribution infrastructure and branding in India. But this was the time when Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola came back to India again. I'm talking about like late 90s, early 2000s. This was around the time I left the country. And so much of that learning that I had, and I was not aware, which is why, as people say, like, no amount of learning ever goes to a waste as long as you know how to utilize it at the right point in time. And I didn't really know where all that was leading to, but I think a lot of my experiments that I actually even continue to do right now are so driven by things that I actually learned in the days at PepsiCo. So I think the salient outcome of my experience at PepsiCo was just very deep understanding of intense distribution, and customer development sort of frameworks. And that's the kind of job that I used to do. So I feel very fortunate that I actually had that experience. Otherwise, I would be like deer in headlights, given the fact that I'm actually back to this region. So I think that experience sort of stands out. And I think you were asking me about my experience before the Bay Area or before Google.
Before Google,
Yeah.
primarily.
So in post business school, I actually worked for a startup for a short duration. We sold it to IBM, which was, and it was all in actually Redwood Shores, right in front of Oracle, the iconic Oracle buildings. Used to be on Twin Dolphin Drive. So I was there for a short while. Um, I was very lucky because I actually was able to experience the ups and downs of a start. I was one of the earlier employees, so I was lucky in that I saw the company through massive ups and financial rounds, as well as some trouble that brewed, and we as a company had to go through some downsizing, and then subsequently emerge and actually sell the company to IBM. So in a short duration, actually, I was very lucky because I worked closely with the founders and the founding team. And eventually, I was sort of one of the more senior folks and tenured, and was based sort of in the Bay Area for a few years. So I think that experience really probably exposed me significantly to the world of the venture capitalists, so to say, in the Bay Area, and what it actually meant um, um, for a startup company and the startup idea to go from being an idea to achieving product market fit to actually achieving its generation one commercialization, and subsequently to exit. I think it was very, very fortunate to see, culture building and the type of people who are great and who can build a great company. And sometimes when wrong hiring could actually lead to, a lot of heartburn subsequently. So I was lucky in that, Pepsi in that sense sort of gave me a short, introduction to, as I said, sort of consumer distribution infrastructure, which I think I utilize to my benefit instead of even when I'm building my own company. And I think with Instantuate, which eventually got sold to IBM, so in that sense, it was a very pleasant experience. And I was fortunate that I saw it in such a short period of time. But the ups and downs, and it's never a straight line with a startup. So I was
Yeah.
fortunate that I saw, yeah. So I was able to sort of see that, that amplitude, and the ups and downs of that pendulum at such an early age. And I was lucky to actually be in the Bay Area to
Awesome. So now I want to briefly touch on your time at Google, right, where I know you worked for a while. So I know that you and your team, you were responsible for building, as you mentioned, some of the biggest businesses that Google now runs on, right? AdSense, Google Wallet, the ad network, all of that. So first off, can you just tell me a little bit about what the process of building these key products within like a larger company was like?
So I think at the time I joined Google, it was still a small company, right? I
Hmm.
joined the company, I think, just sort of a year and a half after it gone public. Um, but I think the the fast pace of Google continued and continues to inspire. But I think my core years with Google were really the core years of Google as a platform, sort of dominating its space, and great ideas like Google Maps and Android, and sort of the early years of YouTube, amongst, my God, like dozens and dozens of great products that sort of I experienced. I think Google in particular, I think, I I I trust you. I cannot, name any other company um, which could think of such large ideas, um, and break it down into very simple, easy principles. I think which is very unique. I think, at Google, and I can very confidently say that there are very few companies which have the ethos and the ability to think that big and to put that much momentum behind these ideas. I think that was very unique at Google. The second thing, obviously, the culture. I think we weren't afraid to fail. Like, I don't think failure meant anything. So there was, and I think there was a lot of emphasis placed on thinking big, and the ability to actually execute around big thoughts that you came up with. And if you had that dent, you could go as far as you want. I mean, look at some of the great products they actually came from. You know, they came from people who were actually working in the company. Right?
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate to sort of be part of that culture. And I think thirdly, which is very unique about Google, is really the culture. I think Google was, and at least in the duration that I actually spent time, it was a place for you to actually, I think, understand entrepreneurship in in a in a very well moderated sort of setup. It was happily, it was a structured chaos. I'd say, I think that's the best way to sort of describe that setup which I was a part of. So, you could you're free to think, you're free to actually get support, you're free to think as much and as big as you can think. And I think Google, I think Google kind of created a good structure which mirrored how entrepreneurs go through building their companies, right? So it wasn't
Hmm.
that because of the fact that we were working for Google and we actually had all these insane resources, we actually could actually go and spend millions of dollars in marketing, for example,
Yeah.
right? We would still be constrained by resources. We would still be constrained by marketing dollars, and which in a way is actually the life of a founder, right? And there are multiple dozens of great ideas that were brewing within the Google community. Um, Not everything would actually earn the credit to actually raise so-called capital from within the founders and sort of the founding structure. So I think in that sense, the ability for us to actually do a good job and demonstrate product market fit for our ideas, have the same discipline as founders do, and go from stage to stage, fail fast, and always optimize on speed, always optimize on execution. I think that discipline and that culture was very nicely institutionalized, at Google, and it probably still is a company. which is the closest between a very successful professional outfit and a very successful, well revered academic institution. And
Hmm.
that's the right way to describe Google. So there was a very healthy disregard for the impossible. There was sort of massive focus placed on first principle thinking and breaking down the problems. Insane focus on selecting the right people for the ideas, like even into Google and even selection into teams. And I think so there was this very healthy camaraderie, and there was a healthy spirit of competition. But it was all done in a very collegiate atmosphere, if I could sort of describe. And I think those were very institutional effect and impact on my own psyche. So I think Google, from that perspective, I think is and continues to be, as I actually described it, it's not only was it a very successful professional experience, but I still count it as amongst one of my most immersive academic experience, of all times. It taught me how to be an entrepreneur, in that.
Awesome. I think that provides a great segue actually to the next question that I was going to ask, which is why did you decide to leave Google, right? And how did you justify the risk to go and become an entrepreneur and found Livespace?
I'd spent substantial amount of time at Google, and starting about 2011, I guess, I had started becoming significantly more involved in angel investing and understanding the art of venture capital investing, and it excited me. Building ideas and the journeys that good quality entrepreneurs go through. Just looking at honestly Larry, Sergey, and the great set of people that they actually had in their founding team, which obviously makes a lot more sense to me now because I'm perhaps in the same shoe. But I think we were lucky to actually experience their own journeys. So I think, of course, Larry and Sergey are, of course, one of the bigger influences, from that perspective. But I think early stage investing, I think perhaps was the other, factor that I got. I was lucky to be a part of, and I think I was lucky that those founders considered me, valuable enough to, partner with me. And capital is easy. Smart founders are able to raise capital. So it was fortunate for me to actually experience their journeys firsthand. And I would say it was an assortment of these kind of experiences that, um, you know, give you the self view that hey, even I can do it, right? So I think that belief is crucial, of course, and I think because entrepreneurship is a hard journey, and you need to be able to have just insane belief in yourself and your family and your co-founders and your co-founding team, and that happens over a step, in a sequence. But I think it starts with you having just insane belief in your own abilities to be able to do it, because you're most likely doing a great job. And I think at the time I left Google, I was probably at the peak of my career at Google, and there was always the chance to actually go and work for another company or stay at Google and continue to sort of grow professionally. Or um, I think I was, I sort of evaluated the risk of me doing something at that stage, and I realized that the my the my the worst case option for me is so good that um, I have I have no excuse not to try things out. And so I think I was lucky that I had sort of gone through a very good sort of career path over the previous decade, because the company got sold. Google was an outstanding journey. I felt that I was lucky to experience a lot of things firsthand by virtue of my angel investing activities, and it sort of gave me the mental aptitude and perhaps the comfort, also the network,
Mm.
right? Wherein you're spending so much time with people from the ecosystem that at some level there will be a point in time that you will in your head sort of calculate the risk return scenario and actually take a chance. So I literally quit Google, really not necessarily precisely knowing what I'm going to do later, but I really needed the time with myself. And I think I was still in the Bay Area at that point in time. I think you guys had moved to India during that duration. So it was that duration wherein I actually quit my job. I was actually in the Bay Area for almost a good year before I started spending a lot more time in my startup. But it was during that interim that I actually had the time to work a lot closely on my own idea, and then understand early stage sort of investing, and just be able to immerse a lot of time in the ecosystem to understand the discipline of building a company.
Awesome. So now to start off with, can you tell me a little bit about, we touched on this briefly already, but the experiences prior to building Livespace, right? Like working at Accenture, working at Google, how specifically did you implement that in the way that you start to build Livespace?
Um, I think every idea is unique. So to that extent, um, you'll learn things that you don't know. So no matter how much you prepare, you will get into a startup with all your eyes open, and be surprised like every week, and then hopefully every month, and then every 6 months. So the surprises will continue, and then you will learn, and hopefully you're humble enough to learn through those experiences. So um, I think there is no amount of work anywhere else that can actually prepare you for what will happen in your own idea. So I think that's that. So if there is an education to be done on how to build a great company, I'll be the first student there. So I wish that existed anywhere else. So doing your own thing is the best education. But I think two or three things. I think there's something very unique about the Bay Area and San Francisco as a geography. I think there's a healthy disregard for the impossible, right? That's one. There is actually the humility of actually finding very great talent and learning from them. I think that's that. And there's the, you can find successful examples that you can emulate, right?
Yeah.
So it's that confluence of two or three vectors that is actually very unique about the Bay Area, probably for one place, on the planet. And I can see, small pockets of that. I think Bangalore is amazing. I think it's actually going through that same, momentum as I speak. I think Singapore is early, but actually sort of starting to get there. I think there are two or three other sort of places. I think Seattle is early. Seattle is getting there. Boston has had it for a while. So
Yeah.
there are that, but Bay Area is amazing. My goodness, right? So I think the fact that I was able to spend that much time in that ecosystem, um, you learn by osmosis, right? So it's almost like, and things that I observed was, why did Google actually have a unique culture? Right? Such phenomenal amount of talent. Why did my previous startup and how did it actually exit? And why were some people actually able to raise capital at such significant valuation? How to build value, how to build early stage products. Why is technology sort of the most single biggest important differentiator when you're actually trying to build, a high growth, sort of venture? Um, Great co-founding relationships, bad co-founding relationships, so forth and so on. And there are like a million things I can go. So what was happening, I think, in the very intense decade that I actually spent in San Francisco, Bay Area, working for all these great places, was I think there were things happening with me, Arnav, which I wasn't realizing. But like I think we're all good students, right? So you're almost always learning at all points in time. That
Yeah.
I had gone through those experiences for a while. So when they happened to me in this space, good news was that I think my instincts were probably ready. So is back on some experience that startup or at Google or certainly, or an angel investment company. There's always sort of some reference, some benchmark that was available that I could lean back on. I think it is really those two things. So it's experiential, but I think mostly it is this whole sort of being in an ecosystem wherein innovation is valued. People are not afraid of taking big bets. I think success is obviously celebrated, but failure of any sort is looked upon as learning. It's not looked down upon, right? So that those are very unique traits that I think I was lucky to be a part of, which is something that I lean on every day at Livespace.
Awesome. That's really cool. So now I'm curious, when you first started off with Livespace, right? What was your vision for the company, right? What were you trying to achieve or fix with the world? And how did that vision change or evolve as you continued to find out more about the market you were in, as the company grew, you got customers, all that?
Yeah. So, like I think one of the things that I was very fascinated about, and I think continue to be, is the power of like content, right? And I think the like, and if you track the success of the internet, I think in a way, um, internet internet succeeded because and continues to because we are mathematically able to place a lot of trust on whatever the internet offers to us, right? So
Yeah.
sort of Gen One, and this was around the time when I was probably in college, which is sort of mid early Google stuff. At that point in time, content or access to that content, and people trusted Google to be able to provide them the best access to best content, and Yahoo to actually provide great quality content, and those, or AOL and so forth. And eventually started migrating from contents to products, and it's the success of Amazon's and vertical e-commerce and so forth and so on. And then later on, access to services, and then um, and good quality content, being able to provide you access to good quality service. And then eventually people actually started spending more time and more money through the internet. Like, so AOV started rising up, people were buying cars, and people were buying homes on the internet, and so forth and so on. But ultimately everything spawned or originated from some good quality content that was underwritten, and it was weighed upon, it was valued in a smart way by the underlying sort of technology and the technology platform. And I was very inspired by the ability of good quality contents to be able to drive, primary consumption, and and now, my God, like, look at how amazing, are the things that people are doing on content. So when I looked at my own idea, um, um, when we sort of started thinking about it, of course, and we would summarize the problem definition of our company honestly as late as 2016. Like, in hindsight, 2020 can sit here and spawn all kind of wisdom on how beautifully eloquent were my thoughts about my own idea. But I'd say it took us a good 18 months to even sort of precisely nail the problem definition and precisely articulate the approach that eventually would create this large company. So the problems that used to excite us was the thought around, was not the availability of content. There was a massive amount of content. The world is full of pictures about homes and all that, right? But what struck out and stood out as a problem definition was the fact that it is easy to get inspired, right? So I can find a great picture on the internet, but it is very hard to actually make your home look like that picture, right? And there are companies like Pinterest, there are companies like House and so forth and so on. Or you can go to Google Images and discover ideas dime a dozen. But how do you actually source everything that is within that picture? And our problem extended not just to the pieces of furniture and decoration, the simple stuff that you can buy off an e-commerce store. But our problem was actually more about the surfaces, right? It's like, how do you make kitchens
Sure.
look the way they were in pictures? How do you make false ceilings look? So and this as a problem started exciting us, because we were very intrigued that um, you know that despite the fact that this is a very large industry, home interiors and renovation is about $1 trillion worldwide. And if you step back, there aren't any aggregator brands. Most of the people who've actually made money have been manufacturers. So we were awed by the fact that this is such a large industry, but there's no trusted underwriter or a platform that can actually provide um, an experience to consumers and homeowners that is akin to the experience that they actually get from Amazon and so forth and so on. Right? So there's no price underwriting, there is no quality underwriting, there is no time that you can attach to these. There's no after sales service and so forth and so on. So we,
Sure.
having spent so much time on e-commerce platforms, we're just excited about the problem, yeah, and realize that it is not so much that the content is the paucity about this industry, it is the supply side platform that needs to be created such that you can actually fulfill
Yeah.
to a person's inspiration, to a designer's inspiration. And I think it came to us in phases. Right? It was only in sort of end of 2015 and 2016 that we realized that there's a notion of a three-way marketplace wherein there is a homeowner, there's an expert somewhere in the middle who's providing the solution, but there's an assortment of vendors ranging from contract manufacturers to large brands to contractors to general contractors and so forth and so on, who needs to come together on a very deep technology platform to be able to solve the problem in this industry. And I kid you not, I think the ethos of the company hasn't necessarily changed from that time. And that that inspiration that we actually had at that point in time led us to understanding markets that would actually work well to that kind of a model. So you're fundamentally looking for very deep fragmentation across the value chain. So which means what? Lots of customers, lots of freelancers, designers, small contractors, absence of brands and
Yeah.
so forth and so on. Markets like these give you an opportunity to actually aggregate demand on the platform, aggregate supply on a platform, build margin and build a brand, right? So we were lucky that our idea actually lends itself very well to any market because
Hmm.
apart from China and maybe a little bit of Japan, the entire world is massively fragmented. Even the US is very, very fragmented, right? There's a Home Depot and all that stuff, but that's more DIY. 65 to 70% of the market, even in the US, is largely led by contractors who actually go and purchase stuff from stores here and there. So if markets such large and sophisticated as the US and Australia, Western Europe, Singapore, and all that stuff are actually like that, our take was that if we can actually launch our model starting with India and Asia, and then eventually keep it applicable and open to other comparable markets, there is the hope of us building a very large company, and that's pretty much what excited us. So we just went after it.
Wow, that's very inspirational origin story for the company, I have to say. But now I want to talk about places where obviously it didn't go so well, right? There were hurdles or obstacles. So were there any major obstacles or hurdles, right? Like one or two that you recall that really forced you to make some difficult decisions or some sort of pivot, and that lent itself to some key learning lessons along the way?
Yeah, oh my God, like every day, even now, right? You pivot, small optimization all the time. A couple, and the one interesting thing to to follow as a discipline, and I think leading back to a lot of my learning sort of from previous jobs through Google and so forth and so on, is that you should never put good money behind bad money. Yeah. And the realization that something is actually bad money, which is, whether it's too much time that you've invested into it or too much resources and people capital and whatnot, is that, you as a founder needs to have the humility that um, your idea is not necessarily shaping up in the direction that it is, and that's happening because of some fundamental reasons. And at that point in time, you should pause, right? Because you should
Yeah.
never put all your great talent and your own time and resources into an idea that ultimately is going to be a failure. So it's called fast failing. So you fail quickly and you learn from it, and you have the humility to go start doing something else, which is in a related realm, and then make it a success. I think two things, come to mind, three things actually come to mind. So we uh, we actually thought that I think the first idea, which actually is very interestingly coming back again, because today the consumer is actually trusting content to such a huge degree because of Instagram, YouTube, and
Yeah.
TikTok, and so on, that that video commerce or content driven commerce are actually new ideas that are actually forming. We actually thought that good quality content created on our platform out of the supply chain that we've created would principally inspire consumers to actually come and actually make their home looks like the picture. I kid you not, when we actually launched that idea, it of course excited everybody, us and the venture capital, sort of community and so forth and so on. Great idea, but I think an idea slightly ahead of its time, right? So it would actually draw in a lot of traffic because, hey, these are like amazing pictures, and you're saying that I will actually make your home look like this, but consumers couldn't really trust the process, right? Because why should consumers trust the process, right? So there was a significant amount, massive traffic in the early days, but I kid you not, people weren't even buying spoons from our website, right? So we were all sort of product manager type people, so we actually went back and started talking to our consumers and understood that consumers typically don't trust us to deliver, and make their homes look like the picture. While the value proposition is interesting, which is what is attracting the customers, but there is no trust built into the process. And we learned that consumers typically trust experts, right? They won't
Yeah.
trust us as the founders, but they would trust designers or experts who were from the community. I think that was a very big optimization that we actually did early in our. So migrating from a two-way marketplace to a three-way marketplace was actually a very, very important, I'd say, graduation that we actually did early as a company. I think the second thing that I sort of go back and in the days was we actually thought that builders and sort of construction industry would be a large source of demand, right? Which means, well, people are moving into new homes. All the builders and real estate or realtors or real estate industry is actually sitting on all this demand. It would, in a consolidated way, spike up demand for us. What a hideous insight! It was absolutely not true, right? In fact, the best way was for us to actually go directly to consumers, right? Own the content stack, build trust about the company, work closely with them to actually draw up our demand. And eventually we of course learned what is the right channel. So brokers is the right channel because brokers care about margins. Brokers care more about providing additional services to their customers. So I think those two sort of really stand out. I think the third thing um, which I think became the principal DNA of the company was our ability to actually create a cloud catalog out of a very fragmented supply chain, right? So
Yeah.
how do you actually buy kitchens on Amazon? You can't, right? Because it involves services as well, right? So how did we actually create the supply side fundamentals of the fitted furniture industry, about the contracting industry, about contracting services that need multiple trades to actually come together? Like you can't go anywhere and buy a false ceiling and get that experience, right? So the uniqueness of what e-commerce meant to us, and the interesting thing is that designers and consumers are either creating a solution or seeking a solution.
Yeah.
So designers are designing a solution, not providing a product. Consumers are not buying a product, they're seeking a solution. So how do you stitch the solution seeking behavior of the consumer, the solution creating behavior through a designer, which is all visual, and stitch it to a very deep supply chain, which can actually integrate services, materials, components in a logical way? I think we you, that entire journey happened over a period of time and continues to inspire us in many ways. But I'd say there must have been dozens and dozens and dozens of pivots along the way, right? We made mistakes, we
Yeah.
learned, we went back because we were pioneers, right? So we were doing it really for the first time. But I'd say that those are the three sort of things that come to mind.
Awesome. And so now the last very like live space related thing I want to touch on is the process of raising venture capital, right? So usually on the podcast, I talk to people who are based out of Bay Area, and it's you get all the money you want in the Bay Area, right? Silicon Valley. And so now I'm curious, as someone who is based out of the Asia Pacific region, how did the process of raising venture capital change for you, especially given that you saw it in places like Accenture and Google? How did that change for you when you decided to found Livspace not in the Bay Area, but rather in Asia Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I raised my early stage capital, and we are lucky that we've had oversubscribed rounds, through we're a Series E funded company now. So it's been the last sort of 4.5, 5 years of raising multiple stages of capital. Um, I think the interesting thing is, I think two or three folds. Firstly, in the era that I actually raised my first round of capital, um, most most of the venture capitalists actually had some degree of experience working with the same names that you and I are fond of, from within the Bay Area. So there was obviously that degree of translation, right? So some of the early relationships I actually built even while I was still in the Bay Area. So obviously because I'd already planned to move towards sort of
Yeah.
India Pacific, some of those relationships actually helped me and carried through. So I think that was one. I think the surprising difference between the Bay Area or US as an economy versus sort of India, Asia Pacific, non-China Asia Pacific, is that, and continues to be true, is that um, the US economy is very demand constrained, right? So if you see a lot of ideas actually build along narrow verticals and narrow niches, and people actually go sort of deep down and try to innovate on the demand side, right? And I actually came from that world, right? So I'd spent like
Yeah.
about a decade, so you're living in a demand constrained economy, and there's massive competition on the demand side, and then you're trying to differentiate your idea on the basis of your own value proposition and how technology is inspiring and so forth and so on. I think if you cut to this part of the world, at least the world that I actually joined, this part is actually very supply side constrained, right? So he or she and who's able to actually organize the supply using technology principles can actually have a chance to actually stand ahead of the curve and ahead of the competition and be able to provide um, the right kind of value proposition to the consumer, right? So principally the venture capitalists, sort of, at least in this part of the world, um, are very aware and also very keen to understand these supply side fundamentals of whatever idea you're creating, right? So I think, and we are a supply side idea, Swiggy is a supply side idea, Zomato is a supply side idea, and so forth and so on. Which means that if we can organize the supply using technology principles and use our own unique platforms to be able to um, organize the fragmentation, which is very inherent in this part of the world, you actually have an
Yeah.
opportunity for the technology experience to actually become a brand, right?
Hmm.
And the other interesting thing about this part of the world was that there is a paucity of brands, right? So the YouTube of the US is the YouTube of India, is the YouTube of Singapore, and so forth and so on. Or the Procter and Gamble products are the Procter and Gamble products here. So there was, of course, that infrastructure that existed, but people hadn't sort of built brands in the last 2, 3, 4 decades. So
Yeah.
I think those setups are very unique about this part of the world. I think the third uniqueness, Arnav, is the fact that when I moved to this part of the world, startups were still sort of early. Yeah. So the sheer crazy depth that you actually are finding now in this part of the world is because of great companies like Flipkart and Amazon's presence and Make My Trip and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So it were those companies that actually built the Gen 1 platforms that gave people the mm, risk appetites to actually go and build the next amazing set of 50 to 100 companies, and we're one of them. So the world that we actually faced was a world wherein finding the right kind of talent for your startup idea was actually still difficult, right? So it's
Yeah.
not it's always difficult to find great talent, but today there is so much acceptance of innovation driven companies being the best places to actually go and get your formative experience. I don't think that was the world that I inherited. So so venture capitalists out here essentially tend to experience that kind of a setup, which is radically different from its counterparts, in the Bay Area.
Awesome. So now a couple final questions that I usually just ask everyone who comes on the podcast. First one was, if you were back to being a teenager, right? COVID included all of that, but you were back to being like a teenager in Kanpur or wherever, really, right? What would you build, like, or what would you work on, right? Would you do something that makes you money? Would you keep like playing music? What would you be working on right now?
Like even the one thing that continues to be consistent from the time that I was a kid to now is um, my love for understanding geographies and people and cultures and history and so forth and so on. And I wish I could do. I was lucky that actually I did many times more than many other kids who were actually growing up with me. But if I could go back, I I would spend all the time possible learning more about the world and possibly traveling and understanding so much more about how people live in other countries and what was the social construct and the historical genesis of how those societies and those countries came to fruition. That as a topic, I think oddly excited me even as a kid, but I didn't understand my own passions at that point in
Yeah.
time. So if I could actually go back, I would dedicate a lot more time to that activity. I'm lucky that I can even say that so consistently, but that's the number one thought that comes to mind.
Awesome. One of the final questions is, if there's like one thing you would attribute like your ability to grow Livespace, be successful in this space, right? What would you attribute that to? Like one
Oh,
trait,
oh, people. Are you asking about my trait, or are you asking about one thing that helped?
one anything. Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, I think it's always people, man. So if we were lucky that we found the best quality people who were excited and passionate and dedicated to building this thing, and I think there is no other reason why ideas succeed. It's really about the people who chose to invest with their time and passion and interest with you when you're actually nobody.
yeah,
that's that's the that's the time that matters most. So I'd say people that we were lucky to find in the journey.
awesome. And final question is, What is your favorite number? And I think that every number has some sort of significance behind it, like it came from somewhere, right? So how did you end up with that being your favorite number?
One,
Sorry?
one, one is my
Just the
favorite number.
number one.
Yeah.
How come?
Um, hmm, I don't maybe because I was a class topper. I don't know. So I always so I always had this whole notion about um, um, I have this like notion about um, this thing which I call topper mentality, right?
Hmm.
So, and it's not about just being academically very bright, but this whole notion about being the best at whatever your passion is, right? You could be
Sure.
making the best tortillas for all I care, but there is, I'm like, I get very inspired by people who actually have the tenacity and the willingness and the passion to actually really pursue whatever they're doing with 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 the topper effort, and maybe that's why I think one continues to be sort of my favorite number.
Awesome. I think that's probably one of the more unique answers I've heard so far. Usually it has something to do with like a shape or something, but this is definitely one of the more unique ones. But
The
yeah,
if you allow me one more chance, the other number which
sure.
actually inspires me is eight, because
Uh-huh.
if you flip it, it actually seems like infinity.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I'm really just inspired by the shape of, because it's continuous, right? And it goes back.
Yeah.
It's like a Mobius strip and so forth and so on. So I think eight, when you flip it and it looks like infinity, is the other number that I'm extremely excited about, purely as a visual shape or something.
Awesome. That one's also very cool. Yes, I'll allow you two numbers this time.
Allow me to.
But yeah, I think that brings us to a really nice close. Thank you so much again for taking the hour out of your day to meet with me and come on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. This is really cool. All right, look forward, buddy. See you. Bye bye.
Absolutely.